June 17, 1943. Wolfschanz, East Prussia. The summer heat pressed down on the concrete bunkers of Hitler's military headquarters as Generaloberst Heinz Guderian stared at the production figures spread across his desk. Outside, birds chirped in seeming mockery of the grim statistics before him. 29,497 American tanks produced in 1942 alone, compared to Germany's 4,137. The Panthers and Tigers they had proudly unveiled months earlier, which Hitler had assured would turn the tide, were already being overwhelmed by sheer Allied industrial might. "We have already lost this war," Guderian thought silently, though he dared not speak these words aloud. "We just don't know it yet." Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how Germany's most brilliant military minds came to recognize their inevitable defeat, sometimes years before the final surrender, and how this knowledge transformed them from confident conquerors to men trapped between duty, survival, and the moral weight of serving a doomed cause they increasingly knew was wrong. Colonel Wilhelm Müller-Wolfhart adjusted his uniform as he entered the Reich Chancellery on December 12, 1941. Snow fell gently outside the massive windows, creating a deceptive sense of peace that contrasted with the chaos erupting inside. Just days after Pearl Harbor, America had entered the war, and Hitler had declared war on the United States in what many officers privately considered his most catastrophic miscalculation yet. At 47, Müller-Wolfhart had served in the logistics branch of the Wehrmacht High Command, OKW, since 1938, overseeing critical supply assessments. His meticulously kept notebook, recovered after the war and now preserved in the Bundesarchiv, recorded his first moment of existential doubt. "The meeting began at 1,430 hours, Müller-Wolfhart wrote. The Führer spoke for 90 minutes on American weakness, their inability to mobilize effectively, and their irrelevance to our Russian campaign. When General Thomas attempted to present industrial capacity projections showing American production potentially exceeding all Axis powers combined by 1943, he was dismissed from the room. The remaining generals nodded in agreement. I looked at their faces and realized, these men are either lying to themselves or to Hitler. Either way, we are lost." Simultaneously, 1,800 kilometers to the east, General Major Friedrich von Mellenthin shivered in a command dugout near Rzeszów. The temperature had dropped to -38 degrees Celsius, and the Soviet counteroffensive had begun with an artillery barrage of unprecedented intensity. According to his aide's diary, von Mellenthin turned to his staff officers after receiving reports of yet another Soviet tank division appearing where none had been expected. "Gentlemen," he said, his breath visible in the freezing air, "the Russians have retreated 1,000 kilometers, lost 3 million men, and yet they're attacking with fresh divisions while our supply lines stretch to breaking point. This is arithmetic, not strategy. They lose 3 divisions, they create 5 more. We lose 1. We get replacements that haven't seen a tank except in a picture book." Captain Klaus Steinmetz, a young officer on von Mellenthin's staff, recorded in his personal journal how the general had taken him aside after the meeting. The general asked if I had studied economics before the war. When I told him I had completed 2 years at university in Hamburg, he showed me a captured Soviet production directive. "They're moving entire factories beyond the Urals," he said. "While we're measuring our advances in kilometers, they're building an industrial base we cannot reach. Even if we take Moscow, how does that help us if they're producing 5 tanks to our 1 from factories in the Urals?" The German realization of inevitable defeat emerged through distinct phases that military historians have since categorized: initial doubt, concrete recognition, private acknowledgement among peers, and finally, the actions taken with this forbidden knowledge. For the logistics and intelligence officers, the awakening came first. Colonel Walter Warlimont of the OKW operations staff noted in his post-war memoirs that by early 1942, the section responsible for analyzing enemy industrial capacity had created 2 sets of reports: the actual figures, seen by only a handful of senior officers, and the heavily edited versions presented to Hitler that downplayed Allied production by up to 60%. We knew the genuine numbers would trigger one of his rages, Wehrmacht wrote. After such outbursts, more officers would be replaced with ideological loyalists, making our situation worse. So we maintained this deception even as the actual figures became more terrifying each month. By April 1942, our private assessment was that German production capacity represented only 19% of the combined Allied potential. Victory was mathematically impossible. The psychological burden of this knowledge created what psychiatrist Dr. Emanuel Schulman, who treated several former Wehrmacht officers in the 1950s, called anticipatory defeat syndrome. In interviews conducted for his 1958 study, he documented how these officers maintained two parallel realities: the official one where victory remained possible, and the private one where they grappled with certain defeat. Major Heinrich Kranz exemplified this split existence. As an intelligence officer with Army Group Center in 1942-43, Kranz's official reports emphasized Soviet weaknesses and potential breakthrough opportunities. Yet his encrypted personal letters to his brother Paul, a physics professor in Göttingen, told a different story. "What I cannot say officially," he wrote in a letter dated August 14, 1942, "is that the enemy's resources appear limitless. Yesterday, our aerial reconnaissance photographed a tank factory east of Chelyabinsk that didn't exist 4 months ago. It's already producing an estimated 35 T-34s daily. Our entire Eastern Front receives perhaps 40 replacement tanks per week. The mathematics of this war have become absurd, yet we pretend not to see it." At higher levels, the realization often came through direct contact with Hitler himself. General Heinz Guderian, the Panzer expert who became Inspector General of Armored Troops in 1943, described in his memoirs a presentation he gave on February 21, 1943, just after the Stalingrad disaster. "I had prepared extensive documentation on American tank production and its projected growth. The figures showed they would produce over 45,000 tanks in 1943 alone. When I presented this, Hitler interrupted, claiming such numbers were Jewish Bolshevik propaganda. He then cited from memory our monthly production of Panthers and Tigers, as if these limited numbers of superior tanks could somehow compensate for the enemy's overwhelming quantity. As I left the meeting, I realized we were no longer fighting the war with reality as our reference point. The war was effectively lost that day, though we would fight for 2 more years." For Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the revelation came in North Africa. Having been celebrated as the Desert Fox for his tactical brilliance, he found himself systematically overwhelmed by British material superiority by mid-1942. His aide, Lieutenant Alfred Berndt, recorded a conversation following the receipt of supply figures in July 1942. "The field marshal was unusually quiet after reviewing the logistics report," Berndt wrote. "When we were alone, he pointed to the comparison chart showing relative fuel supplies. 'The British have 9 times our fuel reserves,' he said. 'Montgomery can miss with 9 shells for every one that hits its target and still win. This isn't a contest of generalship anymore, but industrial capacity. And in such a contest, Germany cannot prevail against the combined resources of Britain, Russia, and America.' What complicated this growing awareness was the Nazi system itself, which treated defeatism as treason. Expressing doubts about final victory could result in a court-martial or worse. This created an environment where the very generals who needed to plan realistically were forced to maintain a facade of confidence. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the OKW, became trapped in this contradiction. According to his adjutant Captain Friedrich Bachor's post-war testimony, Jodl privately calculated Germany's defeat as inevitable after the failed 1942 summer offensive in Russia. "We were reviewing frontline reports in November 1942, Bachor recalled. The general said nothing during the briefing, but afterward, he took out a pad and began calculating fuel consumption rates, production capacities, and manpower reserves. After 20 minutes of this, he looked up and whispered, 'Even if we stabilize the Eastern Front, even if we hold in Africa, the Western Allies can still land in Europe. They can lose every second landing craft and still succeed. They can misplace half their supplies and still overwhelm us. The war is no longer winnable through military means.' He then tore up the paper and burned it. The next morning, he presented Hitler with opportunities for a spring offensive. As the strategic situation deteriorated, some generals began preparing for the inevitable while maintaining public loyalty. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, implemented what his staff called practical pessimism, outwardly following Hitler's no-retreat orders while quietly preparing fallback positions that the Führer need not be informed about immediately. In a revealing moment documented by his chief of staff, von Rundstedt examined Allied bombing surveys in early 1944 and remarked, "Every week the Anglo-Americans dropped the equivalent of 1 month of our entire explosives production. Militarily, this war ended the moment their production fully mobilized. What we're doing now is negotiating the final terms through continued fighting." For other officers, the realization of inevitable defeat forced moral reckonings. Lieutenant General Adolf Husinger, who served in the Army General Staff, began secretly documenting Nazi atrocities in 1943, hiding his notes inside technical manuals. After surviving the July 20th, 1944 bomb plot against Hitler, though he was not directly involved, he wrote in his hidden diary, "We continue fighting not for victory, which has been impossible since at least Stalingrad, but out of fear of what we have done to our enemies. The crimes committed in the East have trapped us in this war." The generals who saw the production figures, who recognized our defeat years ago, now perpetuate the slaughter because they fear the consequences of our actions. We have become accomplices not just through our silence about the atrocities, but by prolonging a war we know is lost. The industrial disparity became impossible to ignore as the war progressed. By 1943, Allied bombing was systematically destroying German industrial capacity while American factories operated safely beyond reach. Major Walter Dornberger of the V-2 rocket program recorded a conversation with Albert Speer, Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production, after a tour of damaged factories in November 1943. Speer spoke with unusual candor. Dornberger wrote, he said, "The Americans produced 9,000 aircraft last month. We produced 1,000. Their factories operate 24 hours without fear of bombing. They're building Liberty ships in days while we struggle to replace sunken U-boats in months. Their production increases quarterly while ours decreases. We've already lost the war of material, which means we've lost the war itself." When I asked why he didn't tell Hitler, he laughed without humor and said, "Because then I would be replaced by someone who would lie, and our situation would be even worse." This disparity was especially evident to officers who had direct exposure to Allied capabilities. General Hans Speidel, who served as Rommel's chief of staff in France before D-Day, organized an intelligence briefing in April 1944 that compared Allied and German capabilities for the coming invasion. The numbers were so lopsided that several officers initially refused to believe them. For the invasion, the Allies have assembled approximately 11,000 aircraft, 6,000 ships, and 2,000 landing craft, Speidel explained. They can put 1 million men into France within 30 days. Our Luftwaffe can muster perhaps 500 operational aircraft on a good day. Our naval presence is negligible. We have significant ground forces but inadequate mobility due to fuel constraints and Allied air superiority. Gentlemen, we are no longer fighting for victory, but for negotiation leverage. Every day we delay them improves our potential peace terms. But that is our only achievable goal now. Captain Werner Pluskat, an artillery officer who would later be immortalized in Cornelius Ryan's The Longest Day, was present at this briefing. In an interview conducted in 1967, he recalled the stunned silence that followed Speidel's assessment. "We had been told repeatedly that miracle weapons would turn the tide," Pluskat said. Yet here was mathematical proof that even if the reported capabilities of the V weapons were true, which many of us doubted, they couldn't possibly overcome such overwhelming force. I realized then that every German soldier who would die in the coming battle would die for a cause already lost. It was the longest night of my life, wrestling with what duty meant under such circumstances. The growing awareness of defeat created 3 broad responses among the German generals. Some, like Field Marshal Walter Model, doubled down on their Nazi faith, attributing setbacks to insufficient zeal rather than material realities. Others, like General Gotthard Heinrichsei, became focused solely on preserving their men's lives while following orders just enough to avoid charges of defeatism. A third group began actively, though secretly, preparing for Germany's post-war future. General Hans Speidel fell into this third category. While serving under Rommel in 1944, he became connected to resistance circles. Though not directly involved in the July 20th plot to kill Hitler, he helped create hidden documentation of war crimes that could later establish that not all German officers were complicit. His aide, Lieutenant Paul Diesbach, later testified that Speidel told him in June 1944, "Germany lost this war in 1941. Everything since has been an expensive postponement of the inevitable. Our task now is to ensure enough of Germany survives to rebuild after Hitler's war destroys what remains." For some officers, the production disparity between Germany and the Allies became physically visible through captured equipment. Colonel Hans von Luck of the 21st Panzer Division described examining captured American equipment after the Normandy landings. Their standard trucks had automatic transmissions we considered luxury features, he wrote in his memoirs. Their combat rations contained items, chocolate, canned fruit, cigarettes, our men hadn't seen in years. Even their field telephones were superior. I remember a staff meeting where our signals officer demonstrated an American field telephone set. One of our company commanders picked it up and said, "If they give this to ordinary soldiers, imagine what their tanks must be like." The room went silent. We all understood what it meant about their industrial capacity compared to ours. This material superiority extended to medical care, further demoralizing German officers. Dr. Karl Wagner, a military surgeon with the 116th Panzer Division, documented his reaction to capturing an American field hospital in July 1944. "They had antibiotics in quantities we could only dream of," he wrote. Plasma, surgical equipment, anesthetics, enough to treat hundreds of casualties. We had been reusing bandages for months. Their medics carried supplies our hospitals reserved for critical cases. After seeing this, I asked our division commander how we could possibly win against an enemy so abundantly supplied. He looked at me and said, "That question borders on defeatism, Doctor. Officially, I should report you. Unofficially, I've been asking myself the same thing since Russia in 41. The strategic implications of Allied industrial superiority became undeniable after D-Day. Field Marshal von Kluge, who replaced Rommel after the latter was wounded, wrote in a private letter to his brother on July 22, 1944, "The Americans lost 28 Sherman tanks in yesterday's fighting. By evening, they had replaced 32. We lost 14 Panthers and expect replacements sometime next month, if then. This is no longer a battle of tactics, but a simple matter of arithmetic." For junior officers who had been raised on Nazi propaganda, the realization of inevitable defeat often came as a profound psychological shock. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Bohm, who served as an aide to General Walter Warlimont, described his awakening in a 1953 interview. "I was fully indoctrinated, believing completely in our victory and superiority," Bohm said. Then in late 1943, I was assigned to compile comparative production statistics for a high-level briefing. The task required seeing the actual figures before they were adjusted for Hitler's consumption. I spent 3 days with the raw data, and it was like scales falling from my eyes. The Americans were producing more trucks in a month than we had on the entire Eastern Front. Their monthly artillery shell production exceeded our annual output. I approached General Warlimont, deeply disturbed, and asked what these numbers meant for our strategy. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "It means, Lieutenant, that your generation will have the task of rebuilding Germany after this war. Your duty now is to survive to participate in that reconstruction." It was as close as a senior officer could come to acknowledging defeat. This private knowledge created moral dilemmas that intensified as the war progressed. General Heinrichsei, commanding the 1st Panzer Army in early 1944, began systematically exaggerating enemy strengths in his reports to justify tactical withdrawals that saved his men's lives. His chief of operations, Colonel Ulrich de Maizière, later revealed, "The general told me, 'This war is lost. Every German who dies now dies unnecessarily.' My conscience demands I protect my men while appearing to follow orders. He developed an elaborate system of exaggerated enemy assessments, phantom supply problems, and tactical complications that allowed us to retreat without appearing defeatist. By late 1944, even Hitler's closest military advisors had privately accepted defeat, though they continued to enable his fantasies of victory. General Jodel's adjutant, Captain Bachor, described a telling incident from December 1944 during the Ardennes offensive. After Hitler left the briefing room, General Jodl remained, staring at the map. I was organizing papers when he suddenly said, more to himself than to me, "Even if we reach Antwerp, what then? The British would destroy the port before we arrived. America builds a Liberty ship every day. They lose 10 tanks and build 30. They lose 100 aircraft and build 300. This offensive isn't a turning point. It's our final hand in a game we've already lost." Then he noticed me and said sharply, "You heard nothing, Captain. Nothing." As Soviet forces approached Germany's eastern territories in late 1944, the human consequences of prolonging the war became horrifically clear. General Gotthard Heinrichsey, now commanding Army Group Vistula, witnessed thousands of German refugees fleeing westward. His aide recorded his reaction. "The general watched the refugee columns for nearly an hour," wrote Lieutenant Schmidt. "Finally," he said, "we've known since Stalingrad that this war is lost. Every day we've continued fighting has led to this. Our own people fleeing, our cities in ruins. And for what? To postpone Hitler's reckoning by a few months? History will judge us harshly, and rightfully so." In the war's final months, a new justification emerged among generals who had long recognized defeat: fighting to allow as many Germans as possible to surrender to Western allies rather than Soviet forces. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding in Italy, instructed his subordinates in March 1945, "Victory is no longer possible, but how we lose still matters. Every kilometer we hold in the West is a kilometer more German civilians and soldiers can reach before surrendering to the Americans rather than the Soviets." General der Panzertruppe Otto von Manschufel, who had commanded the 5th Panzer Army in the Ardennes offensive, made a similar calculation. In April 1945, he deliberately slowed his resistance against American forces while maintaining a stronger defense against the Soviets, creating what he called in his post-war writings a path of least resistance for the Americans to advance rapidly, accepting that this meant faster German defeat, but under Western occupation. This selective resistance represented the final strategic decision of generals who had known for years that the war was lost. Having progressed from private realization to quiet acknowledgement among peers, they had finally reached a point of acting on this knowledge, even while maintaining the public facade required by their oath. The degree to which these generals could have altered Germany's fate had they acted earlier on their knowledge remains one of the war's most complex counterfactuals. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein addressed this in his post-war memoir. By late 1942, many of us recognized that victory was mathematically impossible against the combined industrial might of our enemies. But what were our options? Surrender meant abandoning Eastern Germany to Soviet occupation. Assassination attempts against Hitler failed repeatedly. Mass resignation would have simply replaced us with Nazi fanatics. We were trapped between our military oath, the welfare of our troops, and the future of our nation. History may judge that we chose wrongly, but we chose what seemed the least catastrophic path through impossible circumstances. On April 30th, 1945, as Hitler committed suicide in Berlin, General Hans Krebs, his final chief of the Army General Staff, met with Soviet General Vasily Chukov to negotiate surrender terms. According to Chukov's account, Krebs made a remarkable admission during their conversation. General Krebs seemed relieved that the end had come. Chukov wrote, "He said to me, 'I've known since January 1943 that this war was lost. Most of our general staff calculated the same. For 2 years we've fought knowing defeat was inevitable, caught between our oath and reality. May future generations understand we were soldiers trapped in circumstances beyond our control.'" The German military's realization of defeat evolved from isolated insights among intelligence and logistics officers in 1941 to to widespread private acknowledgement among senior commanders by 1943, to active though concealed accommodation of this reality by 1944. Throughout this progression, the gap between public and private truth widened, creating profound moral and psychological strain. The recovered diaries, letters, and post-war testimonies of these officers reveal men caught between professional duty, personal survival, and the growing recognition of the moral catastrophe their nation had unleashed. Their failure to act decisively on their knowledge represents one of history's great moral failures, a failure that extended the war by years and cost millions of additional lives. As General Heinz Guderian wrote in his final unpublished papers, discovered in 1998, we were not defeated by Allied generals, but by Allied factories. We knew this by 1943. History will record that our greatest failure was not military defeat, but our unwillingness to force this truth upon our leadership when there was still time to save something of Germany. Instead, we served a doomed cause to its bitter, total end, and our nation paid the price in full. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.